Thank you very much, Is, and thank you for this invitation. I have been thinking a lot about the economic situation in Ukraine, so I thought I'd share some of the things that I have been thinking about and that I'll be talking about and writing about in the next few months. While the vast majority of Western politicians have focused their attention on the need to combat Ukraine's rampant corruption, a far more debilitating problem is being overlooked. This problem is driving the country to economic collapse. It is antagonizing vast swaths of the population. It is alienating the country's largest pool of potential investors and contributing to the growing sense of frustration with Ukraine in Western capitals. I'm referring to the current government's ideologically driven choice to sever economic ties with Ukraine's major trading partner and chief investor, Russia. I'd like to explain the damage being done by the government and review the causes of the unexpectedly precipitous collapse of the Ukrainian economy. And finally, I'd like to suggest why Ukraine still depends on Russia to achieve economic prosperity and how to restore this vital link without compromising Ukraine's turn toward Europe. Ukraine's abysmal economic statistics are depressingly familiar. In the past 18 months, living standards have fallen by half, while inflation rose to 43% annually. Public debt as a percentage of GDP has gone from 40% in 2013 to 70% in 2014 to 79% by the end of 2015. What does this mean in terms of family buying power? If annual incomes under former President Yanukovych were roughly $3,500, they are now $2,000. The percentage of people who say that they do not have enough money for food went from 9% in February 2014 to 19% in May 2015. In the financial sector, the share of toxic assets in bank portfolios is now estimated to exceed 50%, while deposit withdrawals by households in 2014 reached 30% of total deposits. And yet, as the country's economy plummets, Ukrainian politicians are busy finding new ways to implement what can only be termed a suicidal economic policy. Here are just three examples. In January 2016, Ukrainian President Petro congratulated his countrymen on having survived the winter without Russian gas. It had gotten by instead with European reverse gas, which, as he pointed out proudly, was 30% more expensive than the spot price for Russian gas. Poroshenko's pride, presumably, stems from bearing the burden of an additional $300 to $550 million in annual payments for gas in order to end the country's energy dependence on Russia. Indeed, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk cited Ukraine's energy independence from Russia as one of the government's major achievements in 2015. What both failed to mention, however, is that Ukraine's major European supplier of natural gas last year was Slovakia, which receives 90% of its gas from Russia. In effect, therefore, Ukraine was purchasing the very same Russian gas at a premium merely for the privilege of not having to call it Russian. Another example. In 2014, Ukraine decided to stop buying coal from Donbas, the occupied regions, the area in dispute right now, under rebel control. Donbas coal was denominated in hryvnia and was thus much cheaper than coal from abroad. To show its independence, however, Kyiv decided that it would import coal from South Africa instead. Alas, as with the case of Slovakian gas that is actually from Russia, much of the coal ostensibly from South Africa turns out again to be from Donbas, repackaged as South African through a Hong Kong company and then resold to Ukraine. As a result, Ukraine not only pays more for coal, but loses tax revenues. In 2014, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, last example, unveiled a $517 million program to reinforce Ukraine's borders with Russia. Quickly dubbed the Great Wall of Ukraine, critics pointed out that the proposed 2-meter-high chain-link fence and trenches would be of no value against an all-out Russian attack. Former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko compared it to the Maginot Line and Mannerheim lines. Yatsenyuk, however, underscored its ideological significance, pointing out that it was much more than a physical barrier. It was, quote, the eastern border of Europe, end quote. But initial cost estimates have proved to be wildly off target. As a result, the project is stalled with less than 10% of it completed, mostly in the western regions of Ukraine, where that's not where the fighting is. Nevertheless, according to press reports, construction is about to begin again in March. One could add to this list a wide array of minor irritants, such as the cancellation of direct airline flights between the two countries, the banning of 500 Russian films and most Russian cable channels, the blowing up of pylons that deliver electricity to Crimea, for which the government belatedly took credit, and the promotion of a vastly more expensive and cumbersome alternative route to China, just so that it avoids Russia. While these do not completely block commerce, they either add to the cost of production or expand the black market to the overall detriment of the Ukrainian economy. A common thread linking the government's economically irrational behavior is the desire to spite Putin. Alas, it is the average Ukrainian citizen who must pay the price. The lingering crisis has spawned a discussion nationwide of who is to blame. Many blame the IMF and the World Bank in Ukraine for making unrealistic assumptions. Both of them expected GDP growth in 2015, when in fact it fell by 10.5%. And it is these figures that lay at the foundation of the $17 billion bailout package with Ukraine in 2014, which became $35 billion when the program was launched in May, and $55 billion 6 months later. But to be fair, these assumptions were based on a quick end to the conflict in eastern Ukraine and the resumption of normal trade relations with Russia. It could hardly be anticipated that the conflict would drag on, and in addition, Ukraine would add fuel to the fire by cutting itself off from its largest investor. In the first 11 months of 2015, Ukraine's exports to Belarus fell by 48% and to Russia by 53%. But what about the deep and comprehensive free trade association, the EU association agreement, the issue that inspired so many to join the Euromaidan? The reality has been very different from the rhetoric. In 2014 to 2015, Ukrainian exporters could fully utilize only 6 of 36 tariff rate quotas. Inability to meet EU certification requirements is one reason. Another is that demand in Europe for Ukrainian products is simply too low. Ukrainian exports benefited from a temporary suspension of these quotas. But nevertheless, during 2015, Ukrainian exports to the EU actually fell by 23%. In other words, Ukraine severed its ties to its traditional markets in Russia and the CIS without gaining access to new markets. Before the Euromaidan, studies favoring the EU association assumed that trade ties with Russia and the Eurasian Union would remain unchanged after the DCFTA enters into effect. In fact, however, the suspension of Ukraine's privileges under the CIS free trade agreement is costing an additional $3 billion a year. This is money that the limited trade preferences afforded Ukraine under the EU association agreement could not hope to make up, nor was it ever intended to make up. At best, that impact will be within a much longer time frame. According to a study done by the Oxford Economic Group in July of 2012, well before the events that led to the Euromaidan, the total cumulative impact of the DCFTA for Ukraine might reach 3.3% of GDP by 2025. Meanwhile, however, Russian economists argued that the additional negative effect of sanctions, trade disputes, hostile press affecting labor migration, tourism, and investment could cost Ukraine as much as $33 billion annually, nearly a fifth of its 2013 GDP. The paradox of economic integration with the EU, as the former government warned, is that Ukraine would be caught between low quotas and lack of financing to achieve the certification needed to even reach those quotas. On sugar, for example, the government has not allocated funding for the certifying institution for the past 3 years, so there is actually no government body that can certify that Ukrainian sugar meets EU standards. All of this has led Petro Poroshenko's former deputy chief of staff, Yuri Kosyuk, to complain that, quote, there has been no opening of markets. It has been a free trade zone that is only one way for Ukraine. Yet in January, President Poroshenko announced plans to reshape the Ukrainian economy, to make it more suitable for European consumers. The government intends to end subsidies to manufacturing and industry and instead promote information technologies and agriculture. But the total cost of modernizing Ukrainian agriculture and implementing EU standards is estimated at over $1 billion over the next 10 years. Even under the most optimistic scenario, defined as either a, quote, substantial decrease in public services and social spending, or massive infusion of additional foreign aid, economists conclude that, quote, food processing and agriculture reduce their output in all simulations because of the high initial cost of protection and low export shares, end quote. It is becoming apparent that the ideologically motivated focus on punishing Russia at the expense of economic rationality poses a profound threat to the government's authority and to Ukraine's national security. 70% of the country say it is on the wrong track. 85% say they do not trust the Prime Minister. 71% say no real reforms are taking place. Less than 2% describe the situation in the country as stable. As former President Yushchenko remarked, quote, I can hear the smell of burning tires, end quote. Government supporters, however, say they have no intention of changing course. First, they argue that politically Ukraine simply has no choice but to respond to Russian aggression by imposing its own sanctions. The beauty of this argument is that while it makes no economic sense, it makes a great deal of political sense for those now in power. Before 2014, foreign investment was not only largely from Russia, it was also heavily concentrated in the Russian-speaking industrial regions of Ukraine, specifically the regions of Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, and Kharkiv. Cutting off Russian investment, therefore, disproportionately affects these regions. The destruction of Ukraine's industrial base, which is heavily concentrated in the east, thus shifts the balance of economic and political power to the western regions, permanently marginalizing the opposition. Second, the government insists that the bulk of Ukraine's current economic contraction is due to the military conflict in Donbass and the loss of Crimea. It is true that these conflicts have taken a dramatic toll on the Ukraine's economy. By government estimates, as much as 20% of GDP, not to mention the sharp rise in military spending. But even without entering into the question of who is most to blame for these conflicts, it is worth noting that these regions were on the receiving end of budgetary transfers. Ending government subsidies to their industries, as Arseniy Yatsenyuk liked to point out back in 2013, when he was leader of the opposition, would only improve the government's balance sheet. There is, however, of course, that could restore domestic living standards, promote national unity, and lead to a strengthening of Ukraine's international political and economic standing, namely the restoration of economic ties with Russia. The first step is to acknowledge the simple fact that Ukraine cannot survive on Western bailouts. It needs massive, long-term investments, which historically only Russia has been willing to provide. Let me review briefly why Russia is so vital to the Ukraine's economy even today. Despite the fact that the percentage of Ukraine's trade with Russia has fallen by 53% 2 years into the current conflict, Russia remains Ukraine's single largest trading partner. In 2015, Russia still ranked fourth among the country's top foreign investors, but this masks the fact that much of the remaining investment money comes from countries like Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands, which this money essentially has Russian or Ukrainian roots. In the current context, therefore, Russian economic investment and support has become more vital than ever to Ukraine. As the Ukrainian economy continues to shrink, more and more families find themselves relying on remittances from migrant workers, the majority of whom still find work in Russia. In 2014, $9 billion was remitted into the economy by these migrant workers, which is 3 times the total foreign direct investment in the country. But stabilizing the Ukrainian economy is a task that Western financial institutions cannot afford on their own. Since the collapse of Ukraine is something that both Russia and the West say they are eager to avoid, it makes sense to forge a program for the economic recovery of Ukraine that they can implement together. Many might object that the government would not find support among the populace, which is now thoroughly anti-Russian. The truth is that while support for Ukraine joining NATO and the EU has increased, it still displays strong regional divisions. It is particularly interesting to note in this context, and this is based on a survey done earlier this year, that the country most admired by Ukrainians is Belarus. And the most popular foreign politician in Ukraine is Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, a paragon of Soviet-era stability. All this suggests that a policy modeled on that of Belarus would be the most popular across all regions of Ukraine. By contrast, the dramatic economic shifts envisioned by President Poroshenko would be slow in coming even in the best of circumstances. Under current conditions, they will certainly lead to the popularization of the country as a whole, not just the East. What Ukraine needs, therefore, is a good dose of common sense. Without it, no government can long survive. This means the restoration of economic ties with Russia that benefit the Ukrainian economy, at least until Ukraine develops stable alternative markets. To be clear, closer economic ties with Russia are no panacea. They are, however, a vital stopgap measure to stop the current hemorrhaging of resources, manpower, and capital, and win Ukraine time and breathing space for economic reform, and avoid the risk of an escalating economic crisis turning into political collapse. Nor is this choice a choice in favor of the Eurasian Union against the EU, which for Ukraine, with its deep connections to both, could only ever be a choice that leads to civil war. What Ukrainian leaders need to do is to stop trying to pit one against the other and instead embrace the notion of becoming a bridge between them. This is the best way to provide Ukraine with the leverage that it needs to extract maximum benefit for itself. Overcoming the government's ideological resistance to Russian investment would also go a long way toward restoring international investor confidence in Ukraine. In the long term, it might even transform the current Eastern Partnership program from its current confrontational two-against-one stance into a trilateral EU-Russian partnership, EU-Russian-Ukraine partnership. Recognizing our mutual dependency is the only real hope for long-term peace and prosperity, not only between Russia and Ukraine, but ultimately in all of Europe. Thank you.